Okay. We have hopefully done enough preliminary work that we have a grasp of our theme for these series of lessons on ethics and morals in the 21st century. Hopefully we have been reminded that it is the ultimate standard of morality when we know who God is and what God expects of us. And if we really don't have that, then we really have no secure standard. And we're experiencing that in our society, and we experience that in a global way where folks are groping about. Though we haven't used this, I certainly think about it often. When Paul went into Athens and he was walking through the streets of that city and he saw them being superstitious kind of folks, and they had altars to all kinds of gods, and we know something about some of the gods of that day. They were very immoral in how they would worship their gods, and so they had all kinds of gods. But he said something in that conversation with those people in Athens that I think is kind of what we see today. He selected that altar to the unknown God, and he said, "Him I want to declare unto you." And the reason for that is it was obvious in their lives and in their search that they didn't know who he was. In our society, it's pretty obvious that a lot of folks don't know who God is, and they don't know what God would have them to do. Some of that's by choice, and some of that they just never had the opportunity. But Paul said to those Athenians that you feel after him. Almost describing for us is a blind person feeling around. He said, though he not be far from every one of us. And God is never far from any of us. But we can distance ourselves from him, can't we, in our life behavior and those circumstances. We looked last week about how the unity of God's ethics is harmonious. And he prescribes those things to us that we are to understand that it's his holiness. And if we love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we can emulate that holiness and that goodness, and pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. And so even in that description, there is a distinction between those who practice holiness and those who practice what God would have them to do, pure religion, and the world. And yet in our society there is this blurring of the lines, and there's a redefining of terms, and as the prophet Isaiah said, there is this calling good evil and evil good. Kind of hard to tell if you haven't been taught about God. If you're still just feeling after God as a blind person, it might be hard to tell. And so in order for us to really understand the ethical and moral standards that we are to follow, we have to know God. And we spent some time last week looking at Galatians chapter 5 and the fruit of the Spirit. That will be key to everything we discuss in this series. Is if we don't understand that part, then we really don't understand how to make good decisions. And as we ended last week, we talked about the fact that we are mandated by God to be obedient to him. In Acts chapter 5, those apostles said, we must obey God rather than man. So if it comes down to man's standards or man's ethical edicts and man's laws, and they contradict God's, then we know who we are to obey. And we've talked about that probably all of our existence, but we may have some real experience in those areas if we're not careful. We spent a little time talking about we're in a holy war, and I think that's Galatians chapter 5, and that's that war is going on in our fleshly desires that if they're not restrained, if they're not governed by God's instructions for our lives, then they are contrary to him. They will not be in his presence. And that terminology is used in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 16. He said, "This I say," Paul writing to the Galatians, "walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." So there's a clear choice. You can walk in the Spirit according to the edicts of the Spirit, instructions of the Spirit, or you can be governed totally by the flesh. Now, we're fleshly beings, and we have fleshly passions. And God gave us those passions. And you hear the world saying that. Well, God made me this way. God made us with passions, but he doesn't make us to be a certain way. If we don't have our passions governed by something that's godlike, then it would be contrary to what God intended for us to be. When you look at passages like 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, that same kind of terminology is used, and we may have mentioned this last week, and I can't remember exactly as we did, but it won't hurt us to repeat it if we did. But in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, Peter says, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." Fleshly lust. Those things that are unrestrained, that are self-centered, that are detrimental to our well-being and to the well-being of others. They war against our soul. That's really what our focus has to be, isn't it? You're here tonight because you have a spiritual interest. You like to know more and do more in the Lord's service, and so that's why you're here. You're not going to take time out of your busy week to pause and come to Bible study if we're not going to be studying the Bible. That's why you're here. That's what you want to know. Because you want to protect your soul. You recognize that your soul is going to spend eternity somewhere. And there's always been this war going on for the soul. From the very first couple in the garden, there's been a war for man's soul. Now we get some input there as to how we would respond to God's protective instructions for our soul. When you look at other passages like Romans chapter 6, and you look particularly at verse 12 and 13, it emphasizes to us that we have some clear choices that we can make, just like it mentions here in Galatians chapter 5. But in Romans chapter 6 and verse 12 and 13, he says, "Let not sin, therefore, reign in your mortal bodies, that ye should obey it to the lust thereof. Neither yield yourselves members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God." And that kind of sums up what we've talked about, isn't it? If God's the standard, if God's the one we trust and his instructions are what we follow, then our passions are going to be governed. We're still going to be passionate people, but they're going to be governed the way God intended for them to be governed. We'll submit to his righteous governance, and when we don't, guess what? We have a society that really doesn't have any standards of morals and ethics. We've talked very plainly that most of us in this gathering, not all of us, some of you are too young maybe to remember, but a lot of us in this assembly can remember even in public school settings where we would read the scriptures. There was a standard out there, even though we may not have religiously agreed upon what those scriptures taught, we knew they had the answers for morality. And little by little, when those things have been removed from public settings and those discussions are no longer had, some standards has to replace it. What is that? And little by little, folks say, well, that's not wrong. That's not a sin. And there's really no way to define sin. I mean, nobody has a right to call anything sin. And just all by ourselves, we don't. But is there a standard that would say, that's right and that's wrong? We have to decide that. And in this context, the Roman Christians are being told there is a way to know, and you can yield yourselves to one or the other. And there's a war going on, and you need to pay attention. With these clear choices, and Paul said in writing to those Galatian Christians, in that clear choice in verse 17, he said, "For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary one to another, and so that you cannot do the things that you would." And so if you don't have a standard, if you haven't submitted to the Spirit, if you're not following those instructions, then you're going to give in to the wrong side in this war. So they're very clear choices. in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, the Lord said in that great Sermon on the Mount that you cannot serve two masters. You're going to have to make a choice here. And we all have to be clear about the holy war going on. And there's a contrast then of outcomes. Those that are controlled by the flesh, and he has a whole list of those, and we're going to start breaking those down over the next few weeks. Those that are governed by the flesh, what's the outcome? What's not going to happen? Where are they not going to be? They're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. That's the bottom line. You're just not going to inherit the kingdom of God. So have to make real clear choices here, and the choices are clear. And there is a holy war going on that we're going to just be on one side or the other. We have to decide that. Now, you can't just say, boy, our country is in a mess, and boy, we need better leaders. You have to start where you are. You have to be a better person. You have to make good decisions. You have to make choices that are right because you know what's right. And that's where we have to be. We can't pass the buck on this one. We have to decide which side we're on. And if that's the case, then we recognize that the other side of that is there is no law against the fruit of the Spirit. And when you look at those things, that needs to be who we are, and that needs to be what we do. So that's where we left off last week. And I promised you we'd talk about the moral dilemma that we find ourselves in. And you won't tell my wife I got behind on that PowerPoint, will you? I know you. If we take each of the issues that we face in life, and we won't take them all out of this class, but if we put them under the template of comparing them to either things of the flesh or things of the Spirit, we ought to make really good decisions. What happens to us most of the time is we start with the problem and we try to figure out a solution rather than start with the solution and try to avoid the problem. Having been a minister for 37 plus years and been a counselor for a large portion of that time, I'm exposed to a lot of problems. And generally what happens is people wait until it's really, 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 really complicated. And then they say, help me do something. And that's okay. I mean, you need to reach out at some point. But here's what I tell them going forward. Once we kind of work through some things and we're doing better, and here's what I get them to promise me that they'll do. All right, when things come up, you bring those up immediately. Don't plug back into the way you've always done things. You bring those concerns up, and let's work on them right now. Let's have a new way of approaching things. And let's address those things in a way that we can do them the right way to start with. And I say something like this. I do a better job of helping people avoid making mistakes than I do trying to glue things back together when they're broken. We can do it. It's a tedious work, and I've helped people do that before. We glue it back together, and it'll hold water. You know, every time somebody sees it, they kind of see that it's been cracked and shattered and it's been glued back together, but it works. That's okay. If that's the best we can do, we're going to do that. But wouldn't it be better not to have ever broken it? Wouldn't it be better to have it in the state it was intended to be? So it can be used like it was intended to be used. And so instead of us, I promised you last week, we'd kind of talk about the issues of adultery and marriage and divorce, and our society just has all kinds of issues with that. And, I could share all kinds of statistics with you, and they're just staggering. More divorces than marriages, and, sometimes it looks better than it really is. And say, well, there's not as many divorces as there used to be. Well, that's because people are living together without marrying, and so they don't have to divorce. So they don't show up in the statistics, and so not necessarily better, is it? So we don't want to start with the problem. We want to start with the pattern and say, How do we make sure in the 21st century that we have a really good concept ethically and morally about marriage? Then when problems do come up, we've got some way to address that. We've got some way to respond to that. If we just start out here with the divorce, it's complicated and there's all kinds of background and history and stories, and you don't ever know if you've got it all right, and everybody's kin to somebody, right? And depending on who you talk to, you get all kinds of versions of why we got to where we are. Well, why don't we just start where we ought to be? If we do that, then we know what the standards ought to be, and we then can address those things. If you're going to tell my wife that I got behind on the other till I got ahead on this one, I would put two up at the same time, and so I'm trying to make up for it. First of all, we have to understand that marriage is designed by God. There's a creator who designed it. Now, we get in that societal thing and you take God out of the picture, then obviously we have what we have. And that is, we have a society that everybody thinks they are God, and so you're going to have all kinds of opinions. But we don't want to start there. We want to start with the divine pattern and say, God designed it. And when he had finished all of his creation and placed man in the garden in Genesis chapter 2, then he said it wasn't good for man to be alone, and that is the male creation. He was the only one of his kind, and I always found it interesting that that conversation didn't really take place until it appears that he allowed Adam to name everything, to see everything, and maybe just really absorb what it's like to be the only one of mankind. And see that everything else was made in pairs and producing after its kind, and he's the only one of his kind. And maybe that was intentional for man to really feel the grasp of that and to understand that and comprehend that. So maybe he would appreciate the companionship and the sharing of life together. And I think that's what happens with folks in marriages. If they really understand going in what it was designed to be and why it was designed that way, they have a great appreciation for it. If they enter that with a worldly view and a selfish motive, never really going to enjoy what was designed. So it was designed by God, and it was designed for man. He said it wasn't good for man to be alone. God wasn't alone. When you hear the conversation in Genesis chapter 1, God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So it wasn't good for man to be alone. And so this relationship was created for man's good. And you hear the world describe it today, and it doesn't always sound real good, does it? Marriage sounds like a war zone sometimes when people describe it. And it seems so self-centered, but when you go back to the template itself, it's beautiful, and everything that God created was good. Had to be good. Why? Because God's good. That's why. And so if we look at it that way, then we understand the design of it. Then when we begin to address these ethical and moral issues, we have a template to follow. It was designed to endure. I think it's fascinating. I'll never get tired of reading it. That there is just an assumption made. After Adam and Eve placed in that garden, it said, thus. Here it is. Thus shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. What's the example of that? God is saying, here's the first couple. Just like this couple, their father created them, placed them in that protective environment, made them fully functioning. When they're fully functioning, tend it and keep it. When a child is raised with a mother and a father, according to the plan, gets to adulthood, understands how to take care of himself, understands what functions are, understands what the relationship is, would understand that when he takes a wife and she takes a husband, they leave their mother and father and they duplicate the plan. It's so simple, it's profound, isn't it? Thus shall It's assumed that that's what will happen. That should always be what happens. Why wouldn't that always be what happens? Because we live in that spiritual war zone, where this pollution of those standards in our society, and we've allowed ourselves then to have someone else or something else dictating the terms. So that's important. We need to start there to make sure that we understand, first of all, what the moral standards are. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 3, it emphasizes to us in that context that marriage is honorable in all and the bed undefiled. Again, assumptions are made that we understand what marriage is. And if we understand what the original plan was, that a man would leave his father and mother and he would cleave to his wife and they twain would become one, then we do understand that marriage is honorable. Who made it honorable? Well, God did. Why is it honorable? Because it's God's design. You remember in that Philippians 4 passage, by the way, what did you think about this week? And when you were thinking about different issues this week, and I had several people who wanted to talk to me this week, and as I was listening to them, some of them bending, some of them frightened, some of them confused, I couldn't help but say, "Dear, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about they're taking up your time? Are you thinking about they should have already figured that out? What are you thinking about? Are you thinking about those things that are true and honest and just and lovely, have a good report?" You see, everybody who spoke to me had some anticipation that there'd be a response. There'd be encouragement. There'd be advice. There'd just be friendship. Everybody had some anticipation. But if I don't control what I think about and say, what if that were me and the roles were reversed, would I want them to listen? How would I want them to respond? You see, all of us have opportunities, and Paul was saying to those Philippian Christians in our conversation before, is that we have to be conscious of what we think about. And whatsoever things are true and honest and just and pure and lovely and of good report, think on these things. Now, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. Here's this relationship that if it follows God's design, it's going to think on things that are true and honest and just and pure and lovely and of a good report. That's how it stays undefiled. As God designed it, it's undefiled. It's honorable. We have to start there. If we just start where the problems are and we take the context that man has created and try to bring resolution to it, now we've got to decide ethically and morally, what do we consider resolution? Compromise? What do we consider resolution? Well, in my profession, from a secular standpoint, a counselor would say to people who came to them with complications in their marriage, and they said what they always say when they come to see me, we're just not happy anymore. Oh, if you're not happy, don't stay in a situation that you're not happy. Because you're supposed to be happy. You see, that's what happens if we don't have an ultimate pattern, an ultimate standard. That's why we have to start with God's design. And he said, in that context, and we'll look at the rest of that verse a little later, but here the inspired writer said, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. So these passions that we have, there's a way for them to be gratified. And not to be controlled by the flesh. And God designed it that way. But that becomes the standard, and that's what we have to look at. That is the moral standard we have to follow. But adultery, we'll talk about that a little later, violates those things. But in marriage, there's a mutually meaningful existence. And I just think this is left out too often in our conversation with each other, with our children, with our grandchildren, with couples that we may be counseling about marriage, is when you look at Ephesians chapter 5 and you hear Paul saying to the Christians there at Ephesus that the husband-wife relationship is to be like Christ's relationship is to the church. When there are people in the church say, well, that's not really anything for me to do. If you are a married couple, the greatest thing you can do is to try to emulate in your marital relationship the relationship that Christ has with his church. And as a husband, you don't begin to say, well, this is what I thought I'd receive from the marriage, and this is what I want, and this is what I'm going to be satisfied with. You say, I'm willing to give my life for my wife. See, Christ died for us when he received nothing. Be willing to do that. And the wife to be totally submissive the way the church has to be totally submissive to Christ. If we don't submit to him in our lives, we're not going to be added to that spiritual environment. We're going to offer nothing to it. Those are things that are very powerful, but when you look at that, it's a mutually satisfying relationship. What we leave out of the context is, before the context closes, it said that we are to submit one another. Isn't that what he said? Let's make sure that's what he said. Look with me at Ephesians chapter 5. What did he say in verse 21? Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. And that's not just being afraid of God. That's in reverential fear of God, because you see, when we understand who designed it, the relationship, and we honor that, and we realize this is a relationship that's honored, then we submit to one another in that context because he created that to be mutually beneficial, but also a mutual responsibility for us to participate in. And then we go back to the context of Galatians chapter 5. It's maintained when we practice that fruit of the Spirit. We make sure we embody those things, and we do that consistently. Sometimes we read that and we think those are beautiful verses, those are beautiful qualities, and we say it like fruits of the Spirit, plural, like we can kind of pick and choose what our favorite fruits are. But it is the fruit of the Spirit. These qualities are the evidence of what it means to walk in the Spirit. If you don't have these qualities, if you're not thinking this way and behaving this way and living this way, then you're not walking in the Spirit. In that context, that's how we maintain faithfulness to God. We don't walk. Do you believe if we don't walk in the Spirit, are we faithful to God? Well, shake or nod. You agree or disagree. If we don't walk in the Spirit, are we faithful to God? No, we're not. And so walking in the Spirit requires us to embody this fruit. These qualities that he emphasized that has to be true if we're going to be in the kingdom. That love, that joy, peace, long-suffering, and gentleness, and goodness, and faith, meekness, and temperance. Against such there is no law. Now you put those qualities in marriage, you think you can maintain faithfulness? Think so? You remove those qualities, you think you can maintain faithfulness in a marriage? You see, what we're about to talk about for the next few minutes is where people want to start, and that is with the problem. We want to start with a problem. My wife was teaching a class a number of years ago, and I don't remember what age it was, but they were children, elementary school, early elementary school. And one little boy in their class always wanted to answer every question. You know, ooh, 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 you know, every question. I know. And she had these flashcards, and she said, I usually go through there, and those that are more difficult, I just wait, and I don't use those as flashcards. I just talk about them. But somehow, one of the flashcards in there was adultery. She said, I'm not really sure why that was in the deck, but it was in the deck. And so when she flashed the card up there, it said adultery. And before she could take it down, the little boy said, I know. She's thinking, okay. Riley? He said, it has something to do with adults. She said, you're right. It does. And went to the next card. But it does. It has something to do with adults, doesn't it? Adults who make choices. Choices to be married to each other. Choices to be faithful to each other. Choices to even die for each other. That's what we say anyway. And unfortunately, when adultery is involved, choices to break all those promises. Ignore that commitment. It has something to do with adults making adult decisions. And in that case, making a really, really bad adult decision. When you think about that and looking in our moral and ethical context, adultery is a moral disregard. When you go back to look at that passage from Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, marriage is honorable and the bed undefiled, but that's not all the passage says, is it? Is it? Look with me at what the passage says. In contrast to the marriage being honorable and bed undefiled, he says, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. Now, where did we start with what marriage is? God's design, God's purpose. Those who don't follow that plan and that purpose, even though societies may accept it, societies may redefine it, we need to be aware of something. God's still the judge. He's still the ultimate standard. And we kind of need to pay attention to that in the church, don't we? Somehow we think if we can just kind of put the blinders on and look the other way and ignore the scriptures and redefine it ourselves, maybe God changes his mind. And we need to understand that that's not what takes place at all. And so when we're dealing with marriage and divorce and remarriage, that happens. And the Lord dealt with it while he was here on this earth. And you and I deal with it. But we need to know, first of all, what God intended to start with. And I think that's a fascinating place to start. You see, that's a disregard for things. If we break our marriage vow with our spouses, and that's what adultery means, illicit sexual conduct of a married person with somebody they're not married to. That's an adult making a decision not to keep their promises to God and not keeping their promises to each other. Now, who sets that standard? When I was a child, there were laws on the book about adultery. I'm talking about laws on the book in society. There's always been laws in the book of God, but there are laws in society about infidelity. And I knew very, very, very few divorced people. Now, you can't just depend on the law for that to take place, but it tells you something about a society being conscious of commitments that people make and being conscious that there's some standard to follow. And so adultery has to do with that breaking of those vows with each other. What else you notice in the context of adultery? It's me-centered, isn't it? It goes back to what we looked at in that holy war that's going on. We noticed and paid attention to the fact that we have to always be conscious that when we realize that war is going on, that there is a context that we can never, ever forget. And verse 19 emphasizes that there are things that will keep us out of the kingdom of heaven. And he mentions adultery and fornication and uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulation, wrath, strife, sedition, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, reveling, and such like. Can you look at any of those and say that there's not a selfish motive involved? Every one of them involves something that benefits an individual, that would disregard how that would affect other people. And adultery is one of those things. We forget what that does to our relationship to God. We forget what that does to our relationship with our spouse. We forget what that does with the person that we commit the sexual act with. And we forget that there is an ultimate standard that we are to follow. What happens when adultery occurs? Well, there's, first of all, a dethroning of God. And I tell couples when they come to me and they struggle with these matters, obviously people are shocked because promises have been made. Commitment has been given. And when infidelity occurs, it's exactly that. It's unfaithfulness to those vows. And here's what I have to point out to them. A person has to consciously become unfaithful to God before they can ever become unfaithful to their spouse. So if I could decide it doesn't matter what my relationship to God is, it doesn't matter what God has given to me and provided for me, it doesn't matter what I've promised God that I would do in my relationship with Him and giving my life to Him, it doesn't matter that His Son died for me. Whatever it is that I want at that particular time, or whoever it is that I want, I'm willing to forfeit my relationship with God. That's where it starts. That's where it starts. And if I can consciously do that in my relationship to God, then there really is no ethical standards that is going to bind me to keep me from doing what I want to do. None. So how could you do that to your wife? Well, if I can do it to God, I can do it to my wife. Do you see, who is it that we started with that we are to love with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength? God. Who do we have to love more than we love mother or father or son or daughter or husband or wife? It's God. So if the one we're supposed to love the most, we can be unfaithful to Him. We can disregard His design and His instructions. It's not going to be difficult for us to harm each other. It's just not. And I keep emphasizing that because we have to have God if we're going to have ethical and moral standards in any society, in any generation. And if we leave Him out of our individual lives, out of our marriages and out of our families and out of our congregations, and we're making decisions based on how people feel or what they will or won't do, then we're just going to lose the battle on that. We have to start where we are and make sure we don't dethrone God. But Exodus chapter 20 and verse 14 emphasizes that God said, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Someone says, well, that's an Old Testament law now. You're trying to bind something that when Jesus was talking to the Jews of His day and they were bringing to Him in Matthew chapter 19, and that's where we'll pick up next week, when they were bringing to Him the problem. Moses allowed to put away for any cause, and what is it that you say about it? And he said something that I think all of us need to pay real close attention to. He said, have you not read? Have you read? He which made them in the beginning. Now that goes back beyond Exodus chapter 20, doesn't it? It goes back to the very first book. The first 2 chapters. And he said, have you not read that he which made them in the beginning made them both male and female? And then he reminded what we've looked at earlier tonight. Here's what God said. That a man would leave his father and mother, and he would cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. But then he said something else. Whatsoever God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So you have to dethrone God. And you dethrone God by not doing what God told you to do. When that happens, you diminish man. And we'll mention this passage, and then we'll have to close as badly as I hate to. When you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 15, sometimes when folks get caught up in adultery and they think it provides them something. And they talk about freedom, and they I lost my place there. Verse 15. Know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? God forbid. What? Know you not that he which is joined to a harlot is one body? For two, saith he, shall be one flesh. He that is joined to the Lord is one spirit. Flee fornication, and every sin that a man doth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. What? Know ye not that your body is a temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which you have of God, and you're not your own? For you are bought with a price, and therefore glorify God in your bodies and in your spirit, which are God's. In that passage, it reminds us that when we have such illicit acts, we dethrone God and we diminish ourselves. And you can jot down these verses, and we'll pick up here next week and emphasize that. Then we're going to go into looking at the ethical and moral dilemma of homosexuality. But if we didn't start here, it doesn't do any good to discuss the others. Look at God's design and God's purpose, and then we'll go from there. We also destroy his pattern. When his pattern is destroyed, then the blessings that were intended in that pattern are not enjoyed. Thank you.